We're here to talk about the most excruciating part of being a Magic player, and that is cutting those last few cards from your commander deck. But we can help.
I'm Mia, and I'm recording this way in the past.
I'm BZ. It takes me at least 5 days to cut one Magic card. We're the Nitpicking Nerds, sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you figured out that 100 after you watch this video, you're going to want to go buy cards. And if you were going to buy the cards anyway, we'd recommend using Card Kingdom because it's fast, helpful, reliable, friendly, and if you use our link, they know that we sent you, and that's even better for both of us.
You can see in the link all the cards that we recommend, so go check them out. Tell them we sent you. We're also sponsored by Moxfield, but not now, later. You can't guess because if you do, you're wrong. You know you're wrong. We're also sponsored by Dragon Shield, best sleeves in the multiverse.
Good sleeves.
If you use the code
Nerds.
at checkout, you can save 5% of your real money tax dollars on your entire order, which includes their new Halloween sleeves just in time for the season.
Absolutely. We are also on Patreon. If you want to support the channel and make it so that I never forget what to say next, I think Patreon's a great way to start doing that. But you might hear more about that later. But anyway, we're here to talk about cutting commander cards. It is excruciating. It is difficult. It is hard. And there's just so many things you want to do when you build a commander deck. It's this whole process, this whole experience. And a lot of times when you're at 110 cards or even 140 cards, you just don't know where to go. So we've got a lot of like heuristics, actionable ideas, and just things that you can do to make this process less painful and also take less time, because it is pretty time consuming, especially for me.
There are so many cool cards in Magic, and I completely understand if you want to throw a ton of them in the deck, but you need a playable deck first before you play all these cards. So you have to cut it down to 100, and we can help with that. The first way to cut it down to 100 is to look at the average mana value of your deck and then compare it to what power level you want your deck to be at. The stronger your deck and the faster you win, the less like 5+ drops that you need, because you're trying to churn things out in the early game and then slam big haymakers later as quickly as possible so you can win.
Sometimes when you build decks and you get really into the process, I know for me deck building takes a while, so I think something that can get lost in sort of the process and the fun of going to Scryfall and EDHREC and plugging all these cards into your Moxfield deck is that you might lose sight of the power level a little bit, and you go, well, this card's really cool. But if you go to like the thesis statement, the elevator pitch of your deck, if you're really trying to combo or win fast and you've got some really slam dunk powerful win cons, 5, 6, 7, and 8 drops should not be something you're looking at as highly. And similarly, if you're a lower power deck, you can afford more of a diverse curve that, you know, the hump is later in the curve. So you can play like 4 drops and 5 drops without as much of like pressure on yourself.
I think another point of this is if you are putting 4, 5, and 6 drops into your deck, you have to see like what immediate impact do they have. There's a very big difference between an 8 mana I win the game button on a stick like Craterhoof versus like an 8 mana thing closer to like Avacyn where it's like all my stuff is indestructible, but now what?
Or like Meteor Golem. It's like it's 7 mana, but you're destroying something, so you have to get more out of it. Like the game's not over when you cast Meteor Golem at all. I'd say if you're looking at your average mana value, which of course you should do on Moxfield, I would say once you start going past 3.5, we get into what I call like the clunk zone. It gets a little clunky. Sometimes your spells are going to be in your hand, your opening hand, and you can't do anything with them. So if you're past 3.5 and you're trying to be more assertive and win games faster, or you have combos in your deck at all, definitely start shaving those 5, 6, and 7. That's a good place to start. Figure out where your ramp removal and card draw lines up with those cards. And a lot of times where there isn't any, because we all need ramp removal and card draw in our decks, you can make a few cuts.
I think that there is an exception for this, though. If your deck is trying to like cheat things out or has a way on your commander to staple, like make extra mana, cheat things out, then you might be able to afford a little bit of extra CMC in your deck. But if on the flip side, if your commander can't stick, then you might want to balance that curve with the idea that like in an idealistic world or a not idealistic world, your commander might not be there all the time.
Yeah, Henzy's a great example. Henzy's got a bunch of 6, 7, 8 drops because you can just spam it as long as you've got enough ramp. And whenever Henzy dies, you don't care. You just keep playing it again and then blitzing out whatever you have. So that's definitely like the exception, but most decks can go through that. Next up, we're gonna go a little simple. We're gonna look for repeat effects. How many of gotcha spells do you need? How many single target removal do you need? If you go through and you sort of categorize, you can do this on Moxfield with custom tags, but this isn't the ad yet. You can go through and sort of break down each category. I think there are some cards like gotcha spells, where they're like blowouts, but they're not always relevant at every stage of the game. How many of those do you need? Like for real, you got to ask yourself that question. I can't answer it. And then once you go, oh, I'd like a few chances to blow people out, or you're like, I'd like 10. That's definitely something to know, because if you're getting to that 10 range, you're going to have to make concessions elsewhere. We're talking ramp, removal, card draw, and maybe even like win conditions, depending on how many of these things you say you need.
We love to talk about removal, and we love to play it as we have this video, maybe right here, if we could put that in.
No.
But unfortunately, if you have too much removal, then you might not have a win con. We've all played against that one deck where it's like a mono blue or Azori. So it's like, counter your spell, counter your spell, counter your spell. What's your win con? Oh, I don't know. Maybe I'll draw into approach sometime in the game. And we've all, I feel like when you're building a deck, sometimes it's easy to get lost in my deck wants to do X thing. I'm going to put as many do Y things as possible. And if you're cramming your deck full of all of that stuff, sometimes you're not making the room for other things that you need to actually progress the game or make sure you survive the game.
Yeah, I'm a person who likes to play a lot of card draw, and I'm sure in some of my decks I have too much because you don't always need 9 cards in your hand to win the game. A lot of times you need to build setup, and then when you're concluding, you want the win con and a way to back it up or something if you're like a blue deck. I don't think you need 9 cards at all times. So maybe if you're playtesting and you see this is the thing, you keep having way too many cards and you're discarding to hand size, card draw might be the spot where you can free up a few deck slots.
Overall, it's really nice to have a balance for your deck. So if you find yourself having a certain cards in your hand and you're like, whoa, well, I don't need 5 effects that are very, very similar, then you might find that you want to cut one of them. But the next card or the next version of this that we have is payoffs that require you to be winning already. There are a lot of cards that are when you're ahead are great. And in an ideal world, that is awesome. But you're not always going to be there, and so these cards are sometimes dead either on the field or in your hand. These are cards like Roaming Throne, where, if you're getting those triggers, that's awesome. But if you're not getting the triggers at all, this is just a 4/4. Or Well of Lost Dreams. I hate Well of Lost Dreams, honestly.
I think these are good examples, and this is a category of card you should keep in your head. Cards that require you to be winning already to be really good, or they're going to put the nail in the coffin. I think people get a little too gung-ho with these, and they play too many of this type of effect. You definitely want some. We're planning on being in the winning position some of the time, but if you've got, I would say, more than 10 of these cards, or even more than 5 of these cards, I think you might be pushing it, and it might be that, even though you see the deck list and you're at 110 cards, it's hard to know what to cut, but I think just given gameplay, it's not practical to want too many of those type of effects. So go count what you have for 4 or 5 mana artifact or enchantment or creature that does nothing, but if you're winning, it's really, really good. Try to limit those if possible. Take a more even spread of cards that are good catching you up from behind, great when you're at parity or help you get ahead, and then cards to slam the door shut on the game when you're ahead. I know backgrounds are another example of this. It's so easy to say, well, yeah, I'm going to have my commander. I would love to put this background in. It gives my tokens +2/+2, or it gives me a sack outlet. But when your commander's not out, it's sort of a disaster. It does literally nothing. And if you have too many of that type of effect, I think, and you start cutting other cards, you're totally missing out. Your deck might be discombobulated. So that's a great thing to look out for. Cut a few of them if you're not sure. That's a great tiebreaker.
I've definitely fallen into that trap before. I feel like backgrounds are so cool because they're made for the commander format, right? You want to put in a ton because you want to have your commander out, but there are a lot of commanders that are very high value targets. There are very few commanders that really fly under the radar. So if people see all these backgrounds that you're stacking up and then your commander finally comes out, they're probably going to snipe it because then the rest have just blank text. It's just, vanilla, I paid 3 mana for this enchantment and it does nothing now.
Yeah, don't get this confused with things like Overrun or Overwhelming Stampede. Those are cards that are only good when you're winning, but those are the cards that are going to get us from winning to game over. We're talking about the cards that will just take you from winning to winning more. Like Roaming Throne is a good example. It's good in some decks, but I'm saying it's a card that is oftentimes included when it is extra and redundant or not needed, and you could put in something else or get yourself down from 101 to 100. That could be that critical piece that you're missing.
As I mentioned earlier, Well of Lost Dreams is another one like that, because not only do you have to pay 4 to get this artifact out, you need to be gaining life and then also have the mana to be able to draw cards. I feel like that is a lot of hoops to jump through when you need to draw cards, because it's okay, well, I have to be, already ahead by gaining life, and then I also have to have mana untapped after I've spent 4, and that's a lot of ask, honestly.
So we talked about cards that are good when you're winning, but I think it's different to also look at your win cons. You want to balance this, and you want to make sure, obviously, you don't have too few and that you don't have too many, so they're redundant and taking up space in your hands. And I think when you end up with a Moxfield list that's 125 cards, it can be easy to overlook, because every time I scroll past a win con, I go, oh yeah, I need this to win the game, without realizing that you'd only need, I would say, 3 to 4 dedicated win cons. And when you start getting past that, your 6th overrun is not doing you any favors. Even if you look at it and you go, overrun equals win game, you got to check how many other ones are in your deck already.
Yeah, or just how many things you can like have in your deck to get you to that point. I really like things like Return of the Wild Speaker because it does act as like a mini overrun, but it also has the potential for card draw stapled onto the same card. We really like these modal spells so that if you are not in the position to win the game, they're still not dead in your hand, and they still have a little bit more potential outside of that.
Yeah, we keep talking about ramp removal and card draw, and it's going to be something we're coming back to a lot. So maybe we can establish that every deck needs these factors to function at all. It's not related to what type of game plan you have. This is just like the core pillars of every commander deck to make sure you can interact with their threats, present your own, and get it so that you are spending more mana, because generally the person who spends the most mana is going to win the game. So ramp removal, card draw, super, super important. And you're going to, when you make cuts, you're going to have to balance out. I probably want somewhere between 10 to 15 of all 3 of these categories, and they could overlap, and they could overlap with win cons, and they could overlap with your pet cards that you really like. And you're going to have to constantly balance some of the categories we're going to talk with the ramp removal and card draw, because you're going to need some number of those to actually have a functional 100 cards at the end of it.
It's also really important to think of what your commander does. For instance, Jetmir is a win con on a stick. That's what your commander does, and he doesn't really come out till the last second. But because of that, you probably need less win cons in your deck. You could have him and like Craterhoof and Moonshaker, and that might be overkill because you always have access to Jetmir.
Yeah, that's another thing too that I have overlooked in the past when I'm building a deck. I look at the 100 cards online in front of me. I don't have the deck built yet. I have the list online, and I count the commander as 1 win con. But the commander is out every single game. Like, this is going to be your bread and butter. It counts for more than just one of whatever it is, if that's card draw, ramp, or removal, or a game ender.
And as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of ways to incorporate win cons into other spells in your deck. So if you pack more of these modal spells into your deck, you can not only have them for when you're winning, but also when you're not so ahead.
Yeah, that's how you get to playing 5 win cons that have a little bit of overlap instead of like 2 that have no overlap at all. So we go to our next little tactic here. This is more of an imagination, if you will. How are your first 3 turns going to play out? You can look at the deck. We'll get into playtesting later, but we're just kind of looking at what we've built so far, however many cards that is, probably over 100, and we're going to say, what am I looking to do on turn 3? What's the first turn where I expect to make like a pretty impactful play? Am I trying to ramp or something? You know, what? I got to ask these different questions to myself.
I think this is super important, and I think playing against a lot of power levels really helped solidify this in my head. We play CEDH and we build like more fringe decks, but we still know that turn 1 we better have something to do and a lot of ways to do something very impactful. But if you are playing a much slower meta, having, maybe waiting till turn 4 and doing land pass for the first 3 turns might be okay, because if your games are taking longer, you have more time overall to set up.
Yeah, you definitely have to factor how fast your meta is with when your first, impactful play needs to be. But a lot of this also turns out a lot of this also comes down to how much mana is your commander, and are you trying to ramp it into play a turn sooner? So if you have a 5 mana commander, well, in the first 3 turns, you better be ramping so you can cast the 5 mana commander either on turn 3, which is like the dream scenario, or turn 4, which is a lot more realistic and doable. And so if you've got a 4 mana commander, you better make sure you've got a ton of signets. And if you also have like commander spheres or pristine talismans or chromatic lantern in your deck that has a 4 mana commander, to me, those are easy cuts when you factor in your first 3 turns.
I think it also matters of how much you're actually playing your commander and how much you really need your commander to progress your game plan. An example of this that I think of is like when I play my Atraxa deck. I have a lot of little guys trying to deal poison damage everywhere, and Atraxa doesn't necessarily need to come out for me to win the game. It's really nice, but overall, if I have other pieces to do stuff with, I can wait to bring her out till turn 6 or 7, really, to be that like final nail in the coffin. But there are other ones like BZ's Oscar deck where that commander needs to be out as soon as possible.
Yeah, and as frequently as possible. I like that example because Atraxa, you just treat it like another spell in the deck. You don't really care. You're like, cool, thanks for the colors. You're going to proliferate 2 or 3 times, and that's all I need from you eventually. I don't need this to be in play on turn 4. A lot of times you can just wait, like you said. So definitely factor in your commander when you want to ramp into it, if you want to ramp into it, because Oscar is often a 2-mana thing. So a lot of factors, but the key for this, at least, is to plan your ideal first 3 turns and what that kind of looks like. If it's Signet into your 4-mana commander, that's great. Make your deck sculpt your deck a little bit to make that more possible. Next up, we're going to look at the speed of the return on investment of your cards. Not the most well thought out title, but we're going to also explain it. It's basically how fast the cards in your deck are going to give you value.
I feel like there are so many things that we talk about with this, and we talk about things like why we don't like Phyrexian Arena. We joke a lot that, it's about instant gratification. It's about wanting our things immediately. And that's completely true, though. It's not just a joke. It's because they're slower and you have to wait for them, and that's the speed of the return of the investment. You want to have your 3 mana of Phyrexian Arena returned to you in card draw, but it's going to take you a ton of turns. Usually we think that 1 mana equals 1 card, and that's a pretty good rate with things like Sign in Blood, Night's Whisper, etc. But that would take you 3 turns to get there for 3 mana, and we don't really like waiting that long.
So where this actually becomes relevant as a tiebreaker, you're going to have 120 cards in your deck, and you're going to have to start making tough decisions. Now we're going to look at all of our card draw together. We're going to separate it out, and maybe you've got 20 pieces of card draw when you really want 15. My tiebreaker for how I'm going to start eliminating cards from this list is what draws me cards the slowest. I know another one we have on here is Mind's Eye. I just think when I'm comparing this to the other stuff in my deck, it's never going to win out for speed and instantaneous gratification and help me dig for a board right when I really need one. It's more of a, hey, do you have a turn and a half? There you go. 7 mana.
And we're not just talking about the speed of, in terms of like time, we're also talking about speed in terms of like mana value too, if that makes sense. Like with Mind's Eye, yes, maybe you'll get more cards overall than a quick draw spell like Stinging Study if over time and all, but you also have to have the mana to play Mind's Eye and then also pay the mana into it to draw the cards. And that's just a lot slower overall than a one-time burst where 5 mana is X amount of cards versus 5 mana is nothing and then wait. And if you have the mana, it can be unlimited depending on how long the game goes or how much mana you have.
Yeah, that's such a good example. It's why you'll always see cards like Stinging Study in our deck as that instant speed, draw 5 or whatever it ends up being. And you'll never see cards like Mind's Eye because they always die. Cards like Mind's Eye and Phyrexian Arena for our decks always die in that tiebreaker phase where we're looking at, all right, I have too many removal spells, time to make a few cuts. And then they always get the axe. So what do we got next?
The next card or thing that we're talking about is power outliers in your deck. I feel like there's usually a power level that you're aiming for. What turn you want to win by? Do you want to win by combos? Do you want to win by combat? Maybe so, and that's super cool. But you want to balance all of your cards in there. One of the worst offenders, we think at least, is Soul Ring, because when we talk about whether there's fast mana, tutors, or combos in a deck, people often eliminate Soul Ring when they talk about whether they have fast mana or not, and that is completely or it's incorrect because it is fast mana.
Yeah, if you have rules for your play group or you tend to build towards certain power levels and you say, well, we don't play with fast mana, then hey, if you have any fast mana in your deck, really you should cut it. And I know this probably sounds way more lame and obvious than it actually is, but this happens all the time, and this is exactly the type of thing you hear in all of the Rule Zero complaint stories, right? Where somebody doesn't listen. But I think what really happens is they have a vision for their deck, and as they're building it, they are like, well, I want to make it strong. I want to do the thing as soon as possible. And it's easy to accidentally include some power outliers where hey, maybe your play group isn't ready for one card, I win the game by itself, like a Craterhoof or like an Expropriate. Maybe that's a step too high for your group. Definitely worth taking 30 seconds, reassess what level you're looking to play this at. Maybe picture some of your friends' commanders. What do their decks look like? So, does this belong in this pod with these commanders? Oftentimes, I think a Craterhoof or a Dockside was a great example, can be cut. And then you can include all those fun cards that are the reason you're having so much trouble with 120 in your deck. And Soul Ring, like you said, is such a good example of.
I feel like there are so many cards that sometimes they'll come out and there'll be a lot of buzz about them, and because of that everyone wants to try it, but it's not always the right power level. One of them is the One Ring. BZ and I have both had trouble with the One Ring in our decks. I tried to just throw it in an Edgar Markov deck because I wanted card draw, but it was just too powerful for the games that I wanted to play in, because it was basically I win the game on an artifact, and I was just drawing so many cards, and with a consistent source of life game through Extort or other types of triggers in that deck, I was just consistently getting these cards.
Yeah, and it was that in your Edgar deck, and it was One Ring in my Cascade deck, because we were like, cool, card draw. But actually One Ring was soloing games where the rest of the cards in our deck were here, and One Ring is over here, just dominating everyone by itself. And we realized at the end, we're like, oh, this was a huge power outlier. And then that let us cut it play another cool vampire, play another cool cascade payoff, make the deck more interesting, and you're going to give up some power, but the deck was never intended to be. If I was going to try to build the best cascade deck in the world, I would have a lot more cards up there with the One Ring. I'd be playing all the fast mana. I'd be playing all the like sweaty cards.
It's really true. Another version of this is my approach of the Second Sun in my Door deck. I wanted to have an alternate win con because Door is such a tough win con, both because it's telegraphed, because it takes a ton of mana, because it only takes out one person per round, I guess. So I want to have another sort of non-combat win con, and I put Approach in there because it's 5 colors, and it's just an, okay, well, if Door gets exiled or something, I can still play this. But my deck was completely coming into a Approach deck because it was just cheaper and easier to play Approach and win rather than the Door.
Totally, yeah. And when the thing to remember there is we're intentionally building the deck to be like this janky Rube Goldberg machine type thing where you have to like really work for all this mana and really get the Door. And it almost like Approach was like an easy way out.
Yeah.
You're like, well, yeah, this is just way easier.
Yeah, because I wasn't planning to get the Door at that point. I was just like, if I drew Approach, I would be like, okay, that is how I'm winning, because why wouldn't I try and win the game as soon as possible? Play to win, right? But if it's in my hand, like, I'm not going to try and get the Door if I can cast it for a second time and win on the spot.
Yeah, definitely example of a power outlier. So we did mention playtesting earlier, and there's this very specific way that I like to playtest, and this is the ad, but it's also part of the video. So if you skip this, you're actually missing what we're here to say in the first place. I love to playtest the first 5, and if I have a lot of extra time on my hands, up to 10 turns on Moxfield. Probably just the first 5. When you build a new deck and you get up to like 110 cards, this is where I love opening up the playtest feature, which is a nice feature to have, by the way, and I'll just goldfish the first 5 turns to see, am I ramping on average in a game? Do I get to the end of turn 5 and feel like I've impacted this hypothetical game? If I've made an impact, I've maybe presented a threat. That's definitely some of the stuff I look for. I also look for what cards are just dead in my hand, and those are the ones, if that keeps happening, I go, maybe I cut this to start.
I love Moxfield too, because not only in the playtest feature can you do that and do it as many times as you want, if you playtest something and you leave, it will save it and you can come back to that playtest. So if you want to pick up doing it later, you can still pick up from the round that you were already on, or restart if you want to try something else.
Moxfield's awesome. Do you ever playtest? Because I do it a lot whenever I'm building online first and then paper later. Do you playtest too much?
I playtest a fair amount, actually, but I also I'm never sitting at like 110 cards, and it never takes me a while to do it. I'm never playtesting with 110 cards. I playtest with 100, and then I'll like make 1-for-1 swaps because I'm like, ooh, this is too slow.
I wish this effect was faster or something.
Yeah, or it's like this is not coherent to my game plan because this seems a little bit too like, left field or something, or I'm playing it because it's fun, but it's not like synergistic with this deck.
Yeah, or if you have these like gotcha spells, those are the cards that you're going to play out your first 5 turns, which are pretty important for getting your footing in the game of Commander. And I realize, this is not going to help me in the early game. And if you have too many of that, you can notice when your hand gets really gummed up, and those are the cuts, the difficult cuts that you're going to have to make. I do like playtesting. I'm more of a playtest with 110, and then I just start trimming cards that seem terrible every time I draw them.
No, I don't know if you know this. I actually just build straight to 100 and only 100, and then I might toss a couple in the considering part of Moxfield, not part of the ad, just a feature they have.
We're using it.
And if I do, I might forget about them later, but I playtest with 100, and then I will cut and just put in as I see fit, I guess. I
sort of add every card I could conceivably think of, and then I'm whittling down as I do this. And then I get to this 110 cards, and it is the most painful. It's like having to say goodbye to my family members forever. I can't do it. I want to keep all of them. I want to play 300 cards because they're all super cool. But in the end, I also want a functional deck, and got to make these tough cuts. Moxfield definitely helps with the playtesting feature.
We really can't play every bauble, but Moxfield will help you with that.
We try.
But that actually brings us into our next point, which is sometimes you have to kill some of your pet cards. There are so many cool cards in Magic, and you want to put all of them, especially your favorites, into your deck. But deck building is kind of one of these processes where if you have too many of your pet cards, the deck might not function as well as you'd like.
Yeah, deck building is a process. It's not just once you build your deck and hit 100 cards, you're done. We're going to now play test the deck in person after we sleeve it up. And we're going to have games and information that we're going to get, and that's going to influence changes. So what you want to do is you want to get to 100 that you can be happy with, but that's not the final 100. So this is where cutting pet cards comes in. I'm going to have 10 to 15 pet cards that I really want to play. Sometimes when they don't overlap with the ramp and the removal and the card draw, and they're kind of just off in their own universe, doing their own special thing, you're going to have to pick some. So one thing that I think would be helpful is to pick 3 to 4 that you're like super excited about. It doesn't have to be that you're most excited about, because now we're in the same position. Pick 3 to 4 of them. Play test the deck as if those are the 4, tough to make work, super fun, scrappy cards that help get you excited for this deck in the first place. And as some of them underperform or some other cards underperform, you can switch, rotate out into the next 4, and then you'll make a better decision. And you might end up with 6 out of the original 15 that you wanted, but you get to play the deck sooner and agonize less over this when you know that you're going to be rotating them in and out as they underperform. As you get less excited about them, you end up with that final 6 that you would have ended up with.
You also might find that some of your pet cards, or a lot of them, revolve around a certain theme. Oftentimes we try and play very similar themes because that's what we gravitate towards. BZ's being like graveyards, mine being like very punchy combat, for instance. You might find that that's just a whole nother deck, and you can throw all those cards in a different deck.
True.
And then focus this one down to what you want it to be, or like the theme that you're trying for. I feel like one of these examples is we were cutting cards today, and BZ was actually,
it was hard,
trying to put about 7 or 8 new cards into Oscar because so many cards have come out in like MH3 and stuff that were awesome for that deck.
Yeah, so I was balancing out all of these sort of janky inclusions. Dream Halls is a great example because that could potentially be great if your hand is full. Teferi's Ageless Insight, another example. There's a lot of cards like this where they're like they're an enchantment or an artifact that once you play it, I'm going to win more and I'm going to do all these things. And I had to start making serious concessions because I realized I just have too many of these. I like them all. I have to cut Dream Halls. I'll leave in Teferi's Ageless Insight, and I'm going to test this other card in place of Dream Halls. It doesn't mean Dream Halls is out of the deck forever. We're going to go to Vegas very soon for us, in the past for you. So I'll let you know later in the future for you and in the future for me how that worked. But I'll play test it at Vegas, and then if Dream Halls would have been better or this thing would have been better, I'll just leave whatever card that is in the deck.
You also have to think about how these cards, I guess, have treated you while you were playing them, and how often you're going to get them, or how excited you are to have them in your hand. Because if you're excited about them in theory, but they're a dead draw when they come up and they're not really synergistic, I think it's pretty easy at that point to go like, maybe this isn't it. Or if it's like, last time we saw Dream Halls, I actually won with it, and BZ did not get to win with it. So
It was sad.
So it's like these cards might be good in theory, but they also might be bad in practice, or you just might need to, swap them out for something similar.
Yeah, and if I'm playing 10 of these nonsense cards, my deck isn't going to do anything. I have to keep the number small. I have this cool subset of pet cards that I love to play with. Half of them in that deck are Mishra's Bubble, Gataxian Probe, and like all this little like Street Wraithers in there. So I'm already losing slots on what is essentially just air that takes up space. So I've got to make concessions. I'll play Dream Halls later, or I'll find this other card is better and I'll cut Dream Halls permanently.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of options, and we all love our pet cards, but unfortunately sometimes you gotta put them to the side and make room for something else.
Killing your darlings will just lead to you enjoying Commander games faster.
Yeah, or new decks maybe. Mm-hmm. But the next one is something that I see when we are making edits on Patreon a lot. This is too many sub-themes. If you're trying to build one theme in general and you have other themes that you're trying to work in, sometimes it makes the decks a little like not synergistic enough, to the point where your deck is just fragmented, and then you're trying to do this, but then this card comes up and you're not really making a thing. I feel like one of the examples that I see a lot of this is like decks that can proliferate, because it's like Atraxa decks. You can go poison, you can go 1/1 counters, you can go whatever types of counters, you could go planeswalkers. But if you have planeswalkers, poison, and 1/1 counters all in the same deck, it's probably not making a ton of sense.
Yeah, you're splitting your attention too much, and you're going to have to devote a certain amount of resources, cards in your deck, to make each one of these sub-themes be as powerful as you can imagine it. And there's just not room for that. You're going to have to pick like a main theme. I like to pick a main theme and then a sub-theme. But I think if you're going past that with like, I have a main theme and 2 sub-themes, or I have 6 sub-themes and no main theme, it's like, this is where you're going to end up with 130 cards in your deck, and you're going to be unable to make a decision. Like you said earlier, maybe what is best is you take 2 of these sub-themes and you splinter them off into their own deck, and you focus on what really makes this deck shine. I think one that overlaps a lot too is people will try to go super hard on counters and super hard on tokens, because there's a couple cards that overlap in that, but they'll treat both of them like a main theme. And that's where, when we audit decks on Patreon, we have to go, hey, I'm going to have to make like an executive decision here. I'm going to cut some of these counters cards. You can leave some of the overlap. That's fine. But, only counter stuff, when you're a token deck primarily, when your commander cares about tokens, it's got to go.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes it's also sometimes you go too hard on the theme. Maybe this is like a separate point, but if you maybe it's going back to the other point of like if you have too many things that do the thing. But one instance is Planeswalkers deck. If you have 110 cards and you have 40 Planeswalkers within there,
Yeah.
you can't be playing 40 Planeswalkers because then the rest of your deck doesn't do much. So you want to make sure you have ramp removal and card draw, as we are mentioning throughout this entire video, and you still have the things that your deck wants to churn through and like actually play. But if you have too many of these little sub-themes that and not enough of your kind of like veggies of ramp removal card draw, your deck just won't function.
Kindred decks can fall into this category. We're going to talk about them a little bit later. But when your Kindred creature type kind of sucks, you're going to end up with a lot of bricks that are going to need attention. We'll get to that. But I think one thing we want to talk about first is MDFCs, because we love MDFCs in this channel. If MDFCs was a product or a brand, I would be sponsored by it 24/7 because I absolutely love them. I advocate for them all the time. And we're just going to talk about how adding and cutting cards while thinking about MDFCs is a good idea.
MDFCs are lands and spells, as we often
Wow.
say. But if you're at 100 cards and you think you're a couple lands short, and if you have a couple spells, sometimes, especially since MH3 has come out, you can swap in good spells, or swap out good spells and swap them in for MDFCs that also take the place of those spells. I think one awesome one is like Sink into Stupor. It can come in as an untapped blue source on the backside, or it can bounce something on the front side, so you're not losing out on removal and you're not losing out on the land side either.
Yeah, I could totally see this happening where in a situation where somebody builds like you do, where instead of cutting down from 150, they build up to 100. You get to 100 cards, you're super satisfied, but you realize, oh my God, I only have 31 lands in my deck. This is where we can now look at our removal suite, card draw, ramp, etc., and make a few swaps. Maybe we give up a tiny bit of power, but we gain the versatility of having an MDFC. And now all of a sudden you can go from this 100 cards, 31 lands to 100 cards, 31 lands, and 4 MDFCs, and now you're like in a much better position.
Honestly, we have really enjoyed having the low land count, high MDFC count lately. I feel like there's a deck that, maybe it's Sorin that I play, that is playing like 8 MDFCs and like maybe 30 lands or something, 31. So it, in theory, like if you want, you can just have 38 land sources, but they're not all lands. And since I'm not like ramping in green, I don't specifically need like go find a land in there. So I have the flexibility of having them be lands or spells.
Yeah, and 1 and 2 color decks, we will often play 4 or more MDFCs. You can go pretty high on them. They're pretty good cards. As much as I love them for making decks better and being super versatile, I actually do not want that many more really good ones because I think it starts to limit deck diversity. How many decks do I have Sink into Stupor in? It just came out and I'm playing in like 7 decks. So it's that good, but I'm worried about, I don't want, that's enough. Maybe we can just have this group.
Yeah, they come in untapped. This is an MDFC love channel. I'm not gonna like go too hard into that, but MDFCs can help you increase your land count if that is something you're struggling with, and if you don't need basic based ramp, that's things like explosive vegetation stuff. If you're not playing those and it's just like go find a forest or something, you might have a little bit more room for like MDFCs.
Always be on the lookout for MDFCs. They could save your bacon and stop you from having to restructure your whole deck at the last second. Next up, figuring out what your non-negotiables are. Everybody's got this set of cards that they will not cut from a deck. And I think clearly outlining what that section looks like for you, maybe in a different deck list or on a piece of paper or something, can help you see how reasonable you're being with what this section is. We do Patreon deck audits all the time where people submit decks and we look at them and we're going to cut 10 cards and we're going to add 10 cards. And what I'll see a lot is that we've got this big suite of non-negotiables. And the problem ends up being it's so big that there's no room for anything. And I'll use an example of one of my decks. I have an Ishkanah deck. It's spiders. You're trying to get Delirium and then you're trying to play a bunch of spiders. Now, most Ishkanah decks that I've seen and the initial beta testing version of mine had a lot of spiders in it. Like you want to play like 25 spiders. Spiders suck. Spiders are bad. Spiders do not overlap with ramp removal or card draw for the most part. There's like 6 that do, and those are the best ones. And what I had to do was I had to make the concession and go, my non-negotiables pile is like 40 cards, and none of them are the core vegetables that you have to eat to actually play and participate in a game of Commander. So what I did was I just said, okay, screw it. And I slashed that list of non-negotiables in half. I say, I'm not playing vanilla spiders. I'm not playing 2 mana 1/1 with reach. I don't care. I am playing spiders that do things that overlap with ramp removal card draw. And now that deck has maybe 20 cards that are spiders or make spiders max. And I think it plays so much better. But like, definitely reassess your non-negotiables.
Don't worry, BZ's not just trying to say, you know, you can make your theme a little bit loose. The spider deck is really
It's spiders.
Yeah, it's like 20 spiders. So is my deck the removal deck, you know? Because I have like 15 to 20 removal spells.
Wow. Wait, whose side are you on?
But if you have a long list of non-negotiables, that might be hurting your deck in the long run. I feel like being very flexible with what your deck needs and also how fast you're trying to play, the metas you're in, and all of that can really help you be a better deck builder overall. Another version we have is decks that have a lot of cards that can be the same number. That's the Dragon's approach. That's a Relentless Rats. Most recently, I've seen the Slimes against Humanities.
Yeah.
How many are you really going to play? I think that's like a good question to ask because sure, maybe you could play 80. You really could.
Yeah.
You can play 99 if you want. Your deck won't function, but you can play 99.
That's the other thing. Yeah, you got to make sure your list of non-negotiables is reasonable. And you can have a deck that has 30 non-negotiables, even if we want to take like Relentless Rats. It's not ramp removal card draw. It's some kind of win con. You know, it's the core of my deck. Great. You've got 35 lands, 30 Relentless Rats, and now you have to make a completely functional deck that also synergizes with Relentless Rats out of your remaining 34 cards. This is where you have to recognize that your list of non-negotiables is 30 or more cards. And now the rest of your deck just has to be vegetables. Play ramp, play removal, play card draw. Make it so that the non-negotiables are functioning. You can't go play your 8 other pet cards with your 30 Relentless Rats. It's just not going to function.
You're going to have to split those pet cards up a bunch through other decks or just not have them in all the same deck. It's just, overall, pet cards are super fun, but they don't always go together.
Pet cards are actually a tricky spot, and they can lead to these infinite loops where you're stuck staring at 120 cards. And I think one of the best ways to break out of that, especially if you're not married to pet cards in particular, but you just want to play some of the cards that have your flair and your style, is get an outside opinion on this. I do this all the time. I just did this with you. I was looking at this Oscar deck and I couldn't make changes. I needed 9 changes. So I went, hey, Mia, handed her the deck. Take a look at this deck for me. What looks out of place for you? This is a very high-powered deck. I'm trying to go fast. I'm trying to win the game with maybe a combo or maybe some reanimator on some big threat. And then she would thumb through it.
Yeah, honestly, I like having someone you play with very, very often look through the deck. I'm like, I'm not scared of this. I don't really care about this. If you play this, I'm not countering it. That's what I do with Oscar because I'm usually playing against... When I'm playing against it, I have a lot of removal in my hand. I have a lot of ways to answer things for free. And what am I using my removal on? And what am I just letting slide at that point? Because it doesn't matter to me. He's not winning the game. Or what can I deal with it or have someone else deal with it in a different way? Or what can I win faster than? Is just a good overall way for other people to look at your deck and see what you need to cut.
Yeah, or she'll hand me a deck and I'll go like, why are you playing this card? Or I haven't seen this do much in the last couple of games. Or I remember you discarded this to a looting effect. And it seems like, you know, that would have been the best place for it. You know, so like, is this card just not ever good for you? Definitely great to get a second opinion. It will kill some of those darlings very quickly, but in a way that helps feel like constructive, like you're actually trying to build a better deck and still end up with some of those darlings that you love to play with. I think this is a great place to mention if you don't have someone to make cuts for your deck, or you're looking for perhaps a more professional opinion. We literally do this. And it's so funny that this isn't an ad. It's literally like, hey, if you are struggling with cutting cards for your deck, we will do it for you. There's a tier on Patreon that you can go to, send us a couple dollars, and we'll cut 10 cards, and we'll add 10 cards. It's pretty straight up, and I think if you're having trouble with cutting cards, what could be better than just having someone else do it for you and then analyzing it?
We look at 1 deck a month per person in this slot, so you can go right now. However, they are limited.
True.
So if they are all sold out, then you have to wait till someone leaves. And if you don't want that, you should get in right now.
I think we might have like 6 spots left right now.
We don't have that many, so you should go check it out.
Yeah, definitely check it out, but how can we not mention it when you're having trouble cutting cards? I also think that lastly, we're going to look at some cards that are played more for the experience and less for the deck itself. Ink Shield is the perfect example. You play Ink Shield because it's a fun experience, because it's a blowout in Commander in general. That's interesting because it's going to have some friction with how much your deck is functioning. How many of these types of cards can you afford? Honestly, if you're going to ask me for a number, I'd say 1.
Maybe 1 is kind. BZ usually says 0. I think another version of this is like deflecting palm. It's like kind of the gotcha. It's like, oh, did you see? Remember last game where I completely killed you with that? And it's kind of like the oopsie just in case. But these are such corner cases that they are played more. It's not just for the whole, oh, I win and you lose. It's more of just like, this is really cool. And you can have those, but they will slow down your deck in the long run.
Yeah, seed time is another example where like it requires you to get counterspelled to take an extra turn. So like, what deck is you can't? There in that example, there's no deck that's like, oh boy, get seed time in there. You play it because you love the blowout of it. The like, are you kidding me type factor. And I think for me, it's easier when initially getting that 100 cards together to basically just leave these cards on the sidelines, end up with a deck that I'm confident has synergy and works together and will not let me down in terms of function, and then sort of sprinkle these cards in as I'm looking to spice things up later. That's more how I tend to play with cards like Ink Shield and Seed Time. I usually don't bake them into the initial, like the version 1.
I feel like sometimes I'll bake them in and then I'll play test a couple times. I go, wow, this is real dead in my hand. And then I'll just, begrudgingly take it out and put something else in.
Yeah, they could end up on your non-negotiables, but just know that once you start getting to 20, 25 non-negotiables, you're going to have the rest of your deck's going to be struggling like, come on, please. You can't spare any of those cards. We're dying over here.
What we're trying to say is eat your vegetables. But if you want to see other videos where we tell you how to eat your vegetables and what removal is good, you should check it out right here.